Holdfast is a game by Worthington Games that came out 1 or 2 years ago, and when I played it I really enjoyed it, and I was really admired by the almost preternatural economy of the design. This was a design that depicted the largest military operation in human history, Operation Barbarossa, and it did it in such an unbelievably minimalistic yet still effective yet still thematic way. Playable on a single and small board, playable in an evening, and with 4 or 5 pages of rules. And yet, you really had the impression that it was a game inspired by that campaign, and you had enough flavor, enough theme of that campaign to be able to identify the main moments of the campaign and the main challenges. It wasn't just chess or Go played with blocks, with components that were reminiscent of wargaming. Heck, it was a wargame, and heck, it was that basic, that linear, and yet still that thematic. So I had such a good experience with the first Holdfast that I was super interested in seeing the new installment of the system, which is Holdfast Korea, which depicts the Forgotten War, the Korean War, soon after World War II, one of the opening acts of the Cold War. So we have the communist bloc that is pushing towards South in Korea, and South Korean troops, backed up by UN troops, pushing towards the north. It's historically is a campaign. It's a war actually that I do not know as well as I know, for example, World War II. So I won't be able to give you detailed commentaries about how history is represented here. I know the broad picture. I know the broad image, which is, by the way, what the game in any case tries to capture here, because like the first Holdfast, this is a game that definitely is interested in giving you the big picture in a small format, the overall view of the war in a playable format. And the Korean War definitely is not one that has been represented in many war games, not at this level like with the entire war. So in any case, there's already something remarkable and pretty good in the fact that you can get a sense of the overall flow and of the overall architecture of the war from a game that is actually very playable, 4 or 5 pages of rules, easy to teach, easy to learn, and playable in a single evening. Let me show you how the game works. Here you see the map of the game. It is actually 2 maps made of cardboard, and you place them adjacent to one another. You may decide to use a piece of plexiglass and place it on them, but it is not strictly necessary. I'm not using one right now, and the maps lay down flat quite easily. This is a block game. Combat units are represented by wooden blocks that will stand on the board, and they have numbers printed around them. That is the number strength points that the unit currently has. The number that is on top is the number of points that the unit currently has. If the unit takes a hit, then you rotate the block to indicate the loss. If the unit receives replacements and recovers strength points, then again you rotate the block the other direction to indicate that. Blocks usually stand upright on the board facing the owning player, so you know where the unit of the opponent is, but you do not know which unit exactly that block represents and how many points it has. You reveal the blocks by putting them face up on the board only during combat, and then you put them face up again right after combat. Now, as you can see, there are blocks that have strength points that go above 4. So because there are units that are bigger than just 4 strength points, so they are represented by 2 blocks. As you can see, these 2 blocks both belong to the 20th Army. They actually represent the same military unit. When the unit has auto strength points, use this block. When the unit goes down to 5 points and it takes another hit, you replace it with the corresponding block. So you simply alternate between the 2 blocks simply to represent the number of points that the unit has, in case you have units that have more than 4 points, but there are also units that have even less than 4 points, so you only need a block for those. Here you have the map, as I said, and here you have the 38 parallel, the units of the two sides, the UN player and the communist player, set up on the two sides of the board. There are locations with a dot, which are possible places where you can set up your blocks at the beginning of the game. There are also locations with stars, with a star symbol, such as that one or this one here. And locations for the star with the star are objectives for the two sides. The blue stars are on the north side, the red stars on the south side. And you win the game if at any point you're able to occupy all of your star locations, that is, key locations on the opposite half of the border. On the board. If at the end of the game nobody has achieved immediate victory by occupying all of their star locations, then the player that wins the game is the player that has the largest number of units that are in supply and presently on the opposite side of the border. So this is a game that is won entirely by occupation of areas, not by destruction of enemy units, even though you will need to eliminate enemy units to be able to achieve your objectives. Now, units, as I said, are represented by wooden blocks, and they are ranked for different traits. This is the rulebook, and here we have a player reading the rulebook telling us the stats for the blocks, or better, I should say, for the units represented by the blocks. Units have a maximum number of strength points, which can go up to 8, in which case, as I said, you need 2 blocks. When a unit fights, rolls a certain amount of dice in combat, and this is the number of dice that the unit rolls. Differently from other block games, in this one, the number of dice that you roll in combat is not related to the number of strength points that you currently have, because you may have much more than the number of dice that you roll, and this is still the minimum, still the number of dice that you roll. Then you have the target hit. This is the number that an enemy unit needs to roll on a d6, that number or higher, in order to hit the corresponding unit. So it's not that this unit inflicts a hit when it rolls that number, quite the contrary. The unit takes a hit when an opponent rolls that number against it. And basically, the target number of all hits is 5, so you always hit an opponent on a 5 or a 6, with the exception of the US Marines that have a target number of 6. So these guys are tougher. Anybody who is attacking them needs to roll a 6 to hit them. Anybody who attacks them inflicts a hit on a roll of 6. And then you have movement points, so the allowance of movement points that the unit has when moving on the map. Now, in this game, players do not just have a standard you go, I move all of my units, and you move all of yours. Players receive a certain number of resource points each turn, and the number that the players receive changes throughout the game to reflect the broader political and military landscape of the situation. So, for example, you will have the UN player that increasingly receives higher amounts of resource points during the game, so the UN player starts slow, not being able to do much, and becomes increasingly powerful and able to do things throughout the game. What happens is that during your turn, again, it's not like I move everybody, then attack, then you move everybody and you attack. Simply, when it is your turn, you spend resource points, and you can spend them to perform a variety of things, which means you have a lot of flexibility. You can use resource points to do a lot of one thing and not much of another. You can use resource points to perform a variety of different tasks, a lot of freedom there. For a resource point, you can choose to replace a strength point, which means simply you take a unit that is not a maximum strength point allowance and you turn it. So you simply add a strength point to that unit. The US Marines are particularly strong, as I think you started seeing before, but they're also harder to replace because it takes 3 resource points to simply replace a single step on a US Marine. And by the way, you have resource point markers that you will place on a track, and so then you move the markers down to indicate the amount of points that you still have after each expenditure. Interesting enough, the track that you can use to keep track of the amount of resource points is on the bottom of the box of the game. It's unusual, but I've seen it in other Worthington games before, and it looks a little strange at first just because it's not something that you have in many games, but of course it works perfectly well as long as you have a way of keeping track of your resource points. Also, you can spend points to replace an eliminated block. So a block that was removed from the board entirely can be brought back on the board, and it comes back at 1 point of strength, and it costs 2 resource points. So if you're replacing a point from an existing unit, it costs a resource point. If you're bringing it back altogether to the board, it costs 2 resource points to get to the first strength point of the unit. Now, of course, this is to beef up your units, to bring them back, to make them stronger, but then you need to also do stuff with your units. So you can spend a resource point to activate a unit for movement, and then simply the unit moves on the board up to its maximum movement allowance as affected by terrain features such as mountains or such as rivers or roads. And very important, this is a war game, you need to spend resource points to attack units. So basically for a resource point, you select a hex containing a unit of the opponent. So basically you spend resource points based on the number of hexes that you're attacking, not based on the number of units that are attacking. So you spend a resource point to activate a target hex, and then you can activate adjacent units of yours to attack that hex. You declare the number of units that are attacking, which ones are attacking, and then you resolve that combat. Before we talk about combat, I'll talk about another thing that you can do with your resource points, which is you can use naval transfer or naval assault, which is when you move a block from a friendly controlled port, next, such as this one, indicated with that anchor symbol. If you are performing naval transfer, you move one of your blocks for the expenditure of 2 resource points from a friendly control port to another friendly control port. So you can move quite a bit. And it's kind of neat that you have the flexibility. You can make blocks pop out around. It's also, there are more possible flanks that the opponent has to worry about, because as you can imagine, the front line is in a very narrow landscape, so it can be pretty well defined. It is nice that sometimes you may perform daring actions and go past the line, past the front line. It is dangerous, of course, because then you're out of supply and your blocks become weak very fast, but there is that option. Well, in any case, again, more flexibility when moving around the map. But if you are planning to move from a friendly port to a port that is unfriendly, that action is called naval assault, not naval transfer. It is performed exactly like a naval transfer, but it costs 3 resource points instead of 2. So 2 for naval transfer, 3 for naval assault. There are other things that will change things on the board. For example, weather, depending on the situation. And depending on the weather of the turn, certain effects may apply. Clear weather, no effects apply. Overcast, you cannot use air support. Snow, no air support. And all units move a little more slowly. But now let's talk about combat. In combat, simply you reveal the blocks that are participating to a combat, and depending on the type of block, each block will contribute a number of dice, depending on the type of unit, according to the table that I showed you earlier. During combat, you can also spend support. Support is represented by these blocks here. And here there is an area where you place your support blocks. They're blocks, but for all intents and purposes, you should think of these blocks as markers. They're simply an abstract way of keeping track of how many points of each type of support you have. And there is air support, and naval support, and armor support. During combat, if you still have any support available for that turn, you can spend support to increase the number of dice that you roll. In each combat, you can use each type of support once. That is, for example, I could use air and armor or naval and armor or all of them if the conditions apply, but I wouldn't be able to use air support twice in the same combat. I talked about conditions because, as I said, not all support may be available. Not all supports may be available every turn. Weather may prevent you from using air support. Terrain may prevent you from using armor. Naval support cannot be used anywhere and everywhere on the board. But when you are in position of using a support and you decide to use a support marker, then the unit of support, that abstract support that you receive, adds 2 dice to your pool of dice. So you simply put together all of the dice that you receive from your blocks and possible supports, and you roll them. The 2 sides roll dice simultaneously. You check the number of hits that you inflict on the opponent, and that number of hits reduces the number of strength points of the opponent. So with 2 hits, then the opponent loses 2 strength points. And in case there are multiple units involved in the combat, then you need to distribute those among your units. Now, this is for the general idea. A lot of the narrative of the story in the game emerges because of the schedule of reinforcements for the 2 sides. At the beginning of the game, the UN player is heavily outnumbered and outgunned by the communist units that will easily start pushing towards the south and easily threaten the star locations on the southern side of the board. But luckily enough, there are UN units that are coming to help. So the southern side will become smaller in the first couple of turns, but also will become thicker with blocks that will be reinforcing and will start to push back. But also the northern side, the communist side, has reinforcements that are scheduled to come, and those are Chinese blocks, and there are a lot of those, and they're pretty large blocks. And the way it works is that starting from the turn, when the southern player moves past the 38th parallel, there is a chance that the Chinese reinforcement blocks will enter the board. Simply means that after the UN player crosses that border, each turn you will roll a die, and depending on the number that you roll, you determine whether the Chinese reinforcements are entering the board. The longer it has been since the UN player crossed that border, the higher are the chances that the Chinese blocks will enter the board, and also they will enter the game automatically in this turn here, January 1st, 1951, in case they haven't entered the board already. So this is how it works. There is a back and forth. First a big push from the north, then a counter push from the south, then a reinforcement wave of Chinese blocks, which will result most likely, or it is likely to result at some point in a stalemate. So you have an excitement, a pretty excitement early phase when both players seem to have a chance to win a dashing victory by occupying key locations on the board, but it may not be all that easy to actually accomplish. And then at some point the game kind of like settles down a little bit into quote-unquote trench warfare in a game that is more about managing a pretty stable line rather than simply having exciting, rapid, sweeping movements one way or the other. Now, as I said, I'm not a expert about the Korean War, but I do realize that the game does capture the overall general narrative of the war, with the 2 sides having the upper hand for a period, with the North pushing south with a lot of strength, a lot of momentum for a period of time, being stopped, being pushed back, and then a second push from the north arrives, and then you have this stalemate line that forms at some point, and that historically remained pretty stable for years until the peace negotiations brought the war to an unofficial end. So On one hand, one of the greatest thing about this game is that it does tell you precisely that story. The flow, the reinforcements has some uncertainties. You don't know exactly when the Chinese will arrive, so that is good. That prevents things from getting too stiff, narratively speaking. But the overall flow is definitely that one, because one of the two sides will be at a disadvantage at any one point in the game until a situation of stall presents itself. This being said, this is one of the greatest advantages and the most beautiful thing about this design. History is there. History is there turned into a story that you can experience and that you can control and you can see as it develops before your very eyes. This aspect is also, in a sense, the biggest limitation of the game, or one of the limitations of the game, because the game feels a little scripted. It is not like, say, in the first Holdfast about Barbarossa. Well, the overall idea was you're going to push as the Germans towards the east and then you're going to be pushed back. There's one, I would say, main action and counteraction, which, however, can be declined in a variety of ways, because you can concentrate as the Germans your forces in very different ways along the Eastern Front, and as the Soviets you can also choose which parts of the German line you want to punch and try to puncture and go through as you are then later in the game pushing back. The narrative is very linear. There's just, again, this one curve that gives the upper hand to the Germans first and to the Soviets later, and a lot of variations in there given to the fact that the front line is so long. Here you have a different situations in which you have chapters of the story. There are multiple chapters that need to be followed in a certain order and will tend to present a certain narrative each time. But the problem is that then within that narrative, which is already so segmented, first one side pushed, then the other side pushes, we got a counter push. Within that narrative, which is segmented already, you also have a pretty narrow front line without so many possibilities for variety. Yes, as I mentioned in my video, you have the naval assault and the naval movement that adds a little bit of flavor to that, but you can't do that too much because if you naval assault behind enemy lines, then your blocks are not going to be very effective. It adds a little bit of flavor and variability, and so does the random entrance of Chinese troops, and so does weather. But these little hints, this sprinkled random verbal element does not change the overall experience. It does feel pretty repetitive, a little constricted each time. So on one hand it's great, you have the Korean War. On the other hand, by capturing that in such a overall narrative architecture, which is so structured, the game tends to feel claustrophobic after a while. Not just claustrophobic because of the narrow space, but claustrophobic because push, counter push, other push, stalemate. I do not see that the game will remain fresh through many plays, as for example Holdfast can, because there aren't just many variations that you can attempt around this formula. So it could be a great pedagogical tool, I believe, if you're showing this to students, for example, interested in the conflict. Some students may have relatives that were in the Korean War. Definitely they may be interested in trying this game here and getting a sense of the overall picture. So as a pedagogical tool it can be interesting. As an introductory war game, of course, it also can be interesting. It would work because it's so simple and approachable and easy to play, but at the same time you already have the other Holdfast, which has all of the advantages of economy, easy to teach, easy to learn to play, etc., etc., and it's more fun and is simply more exciting. So I would say between the two, to me, the Barbarossa campaign one wins hands down. It's definitely the better of the two. The one reason why you may prefer this one is for a specific interest in the theme. If you're looking for a play experience that has this miraculous ability of capturing very complex nets of historical events in a very playable and very manageable game, which is a hint of simulation, but still in a game. In any case, if you're looking for a game that has that synthetic capacity, ability to turn history into a game, the two of them are equally successful in doing that. It is just that while doing so, the Barbarossa game is much more enjoyable, and it can also be that there may also be a personal impression because the theme is more interesting to me. So unless there's a specific thematic interest, if you're just doubtful between the two, I will go for the Barbarossa game. If you have done one and you still want to play something similar with a different theme, and maybe you have a specific interest for this conflict, then the Korea installment is a perfectly fine game for the first game or two. It is not just a game that, in my opinion, will have as much has much longevity, and that overall is not just as exciting, as fun, as much of a blast to play as the first one was. And in conclusion, I want to thank some viewers that have backed my Kickstarter campaign for 2015. In this video, I want to thank Thomas Edward Lass, Roger Mark, Todd Jeffcoat, and Ian McCluskey. Thank you guys for backing the campaign, and thank you all my viewers for watching.